Apologetics. This is, of course, your host, Jim. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Any comments alluding to a topic you want me to cover, I'll get to eventually. Today, we're going to take a literate look at history in terms of the demography of Christianity, continuing from my earlier video the other day, where I talked about how the Nestorian and the Oriental churches had a magnificent amount of population and geography, so they had a much larger demography than their competitors, and yet today they are a much more minuscule minority compared to especially Catholicism and Protestantism. But that should not be used when arguing theology, because in terms of demography, there were time periods when you could argue that Catholicism was the weakest link amongst Orthodoxy, Orientals, and Nestorians in terms of sheer size, sheer power, and projection of population. Now, today we're going to talk about the idea that Christianity is a white man's religion, or that it was founded entirely within Europe, and that anyone who's a non-white Christian, you're just hopping onto a religion that was made only for Europeans. So we're going to dispel that immediately. When we look at the first 700 years of Christianity, so leading up until the rise of Islam, we can see that half or even the majority of the Christian world belonged in the Middle East. The great patriarchates, Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, are all in the Middle East. The population of Christians in the Middle East was also large because they converted in a rate faster than most of the non-Mediterranean Europeans. So not including Cyprus, Greece, Greek Anatolia, and the Italian peninsula, most of the rest of Europe was converting at a slower rate. So you had Libya and Tunisia, North Africa, that had belonged to the Roman Empire, but North African nonetheless. You had Egypt and the rest of the Middle East, had a much larger population than the Christian population of the western parts of Europe, particularly the west and the north, which was almost non-existent at the start of Christianity. But then leading into the 700s, we see the Christianization of most of Western Europe, and even at this point, Middle Eastern Christians, including North Africa, are still the majority in terms of sheer population, geography, size, and authority. The authority figures were still in the Middle East because these were all where all the historic apostolic patriarchates were. When Islam rose, it wasn't until a couple centuries after that Muslims began to be the majority in every single nation. They were the majority in the Arabian Peninsula and the outer edge of Arabia, so that even included Iraq, or at least southern Iraq, Jordan, and most of Syria. But about half of Syria was still Christian. Egypt was majority Christian, I think, until the 900s. So for a long time, you had a very large Christian population that still existed here, even though their rights as minorities under the political system of Islam was better than being annihilated. They were still not first-class citizens, nor did they really become higher-class citizens until the Tanzimat reforms under the Ottoman Empire. But that's a subject for another time. The Christian population held on to a very large population even until the 11 and 1200s, where the Syriac Oriental Church possessed a population size in terms of just raw numbers equal to that of much of Western Europe. So even then, we cannot say, even until the 1100s, we could not say that Christianity was staunchly majority European. Maybe it was a slim majority, but not as large of a majority as you would assume, that 95 or 99% of Christians were European would be false. When combining Western Europe with the North and Eastern Europe, it would then overshadow the Middle East, of course. But these minorities were not the way minorities are today. Today, Middle Eastern Christians are about 5% of the population. Only 100 years ago, they were a quarter of the population, or I believe a fifth of the population, so 20%. Can you imagine now, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, they had a much larger population? Because even though the area was under the domain of Islam, and Islam became the majority, they still had fantastically large minorities in places like northern Iraq, in coastal Syria, Damascus, much of Lebanon, what is Lebanon today, even part of Jordan and Palestine, had a very large Christian minority, as well as Egypt. So it's actually quite recent that the numbers have gone down so much in terms of proportion. And that's not even including East Africa. Modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea had historic Christians that have been there since at least the 300s. We had Nubian Christians before the Islamic invasions into Sudan. What is Sudan today? We had Christians in southern India, St. Thomas Christians in Kerala. So from the 0 to the 700s, it was a majority Middle Eastern Christian, and then into half-half with Europeans. From 700s to 1200s, Europeans become the majority, but still not 95% of the Christian world. In the 1400s, the Byzantine Empire is conquered, and only 100 years after that, the New World is discovered. So there's really only a short amount of time where Western Europe is the heart of Christianity. the 1400s we lose the Byzantines, so the far east of the Middle East is kind of lost. Eastern Europe, we have Russia conquering new land that's been Christianized. But it's only 100 years from the fall of Constantinople until the discovery of the New World. After the New World is discovered, Hernán Cortés and his brave conquistadors, although imperfect men, went on to conquer the pagan empire of the Aztecs, using for the majority of their soldiers indigenous Central Americans who just happened to hate the Aztec Empire. They readily accepted Catholicism, which is a form of Christianity, obviously, and the New World became Christian not long after that, with many thousands of missionaries coming from the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal and Spain, into the new lands of Brazil, the former Inca Empire, the former Aztec Empire, and even up until like Colorado and California in the United States. So we have a massive amount of territory, geographically huge compared to Europe, and their population was also large as well, even though a massive amount of it died due to famine. Even with that, so many millions converted to Christianity. Not long after that, Sub-Saharan Africa is introduced to Christianity from the Protestant and Catholic perspective of the imperialist Europeans. Now we have millions of them as well, and then into the Philippines and Asia. So when we actually look at history, there's not a large amount of time where you could comfortably say Christendom is only Europe. Now, I'm not denigrating European Christians. It would be foolish of me as an Arab Christian to say Christianity was never European, because of the achievements that they had there, the safety they had there, they were always the majority. They weren't minorities like we were in our own lands. They were able to achieve things of great art, great theological progress. Most of the history of Christendom gravitates towards Europe after Islam. So even though the numbers are still in the Middle East for a few centuries afterward, the history moves into Europe. Let's not forget that. All of the great councils, some of the great saints, some of the great wisdom, especially from the Catholic, later Protestant, and Orthodox perspective, are all from Europe. To deny that would be madness. However, what I'm explaining is to people who think that Europeans invented Christianity in Rome, and from day one it was just for Europeans, and the Arabs were just doing nothing, and then one day Islam came and they were always Muslims and no one was Christian before that, is obviously false. Or the idea that the instant Islam arrived all the Christians in the Middle East disappeared is false. Or the idea that the Middle East never had that many Christians is also false. By population size, Europe was non-majority Christianity was non-majority European for quite some time. So I made this video to, I guess, debunk liberals, leftists, and progressives who have an issue, obviously, with their own skin tone. So they're almost always entirely white. And they have an issue with themselves, they have an issue with their past, and they feel guilty for Christianity. But when we look at it, really, Christianity was founded in the Middle East, and for a long time, the Middle East was a very important part of Christianity. And to say that it was just invented out of nowhere and forced on the whole world is not true at all. We can have a discussion about imperialism and colonization another time, two subjects, or two parts of history that I don't necessarily approve of at all. But nonetheless, history happened and we have to talk about it. But yeah, I hope that this video gave you guys greater understanding of the history and some perspective. Because when we look at the numbers, there's not a lot of time when it's just Europeans just doing European Christianity and no one else in the world is Christian. I didn't even mention in this video the large amount of Nestorians, which I mentioned in the previous one, that had gone into Asia. You had Nestorians of Mongol origin, Turkic origin in Western China and Central Asia. It even existed in other parts of Asia for a long time. So we see that there's a lot of false equivalencies in history. A lot of people say things that are not entirely true. They treat religions in a way that is very naive and not literate of history at all. So anyway, I hope you guys learned something from this video and that you enjoyed. And like I said, we'll be doing live streams on StreamYard, most probably. In the very near future, hop on, and the rules are going to be, we're just going to talk in English. I want everyone to be able to witness and listen to everything. And the rules are also going to be nothing abrasive and offensive. Come on if you have questions, but no like 3.5 hour debates. See you guys next time, and God bless.